let us now proceed to the next topic, which is the chest cavity. Chest cavity. It is bounded by the chest wall and below by the diaphragm. It extends upward into the root of the neck, about 1 finger breadth above the clavicle on each side. Chest cavity. It can be divided into two, the mediastinum and the pleurae. Mediastinum, though thick, is a movable partition that extends superiorly to the thoracic outlet and the root of the neck, and inferiorly to the diaphragm. Next, we have the pleurae. Pleurae and lungs lie on either side of the mediastinum within the chest cavity. Pleurae has two parts, parietal layer and visceral layer. Parietal layer. It lines the thoracic wall, covers the thoracic surface of the diaphragm and the lateral aspect of the mediastinum, and extends into the root of the neck to line the undersurface of the suprapleural membrane at the thoracic outlet. Next is the visceral layer. It completely covers the outer surfaces of the lungs and extends into the depths of the interlobar fissures.
Next is trachea, and I will be talking about the relations of the trachea and the superior mediastinum of the thorax, blood supply of the trachea, lymph drainage of the trachea, and nerve supply of the trachea. So trachea is a mobile cartilaginous and membranous tube. It begins in the neck as a continuation of the larynx at the lower border of the cricoid cartilage at the level of the 6th cervical vertebra, and also descends in the midline of the neck. So here's an image of the trachea. The trachea is approximately 11 centimeters long. So it serves as a passage of air and warms it while it passes into the lungs. And it also protects the respiratory surface from an accumulation of fine particles. And it also connects the larynx to the bronchi of the lungs. The relations of the trachea in the superior mediastinum of the thorax. Anteriorly, the sternum, the thymus, the brachiocephalic vein, the origin of the brachiocephalic and left common carotid arteries, and the arch of the aorta. Posteriorly, the esophagus and the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Right side, the azygos vein, the right vagus nerve, and the pleura. So, blood supply of the trachea. The upper two-thirds are supplied by the inferior thyroid arteries, and the lower third is supplied by the bronchial arteries. Lymph drainage of the trachea. The lymph drains the pretracheal and the paratracheal lymph nodes and the deep cervical nodes. Nerve supply of the trachea. The sensory nerve supply is from the vagi and the recurrent laryngeal nerves, and sympathetic nerves supply the truncalis muscle. Next is bronchi. So, bronchi is the two large tubes that carry air from your windpipe to your lungs. The trachea divides into left and right bronchi. So, right main bronchus is wider, shorter, and more vertical, while left main bronchus is smaller in size but longer in length. Right main bronchus also enters the right lung at roughly the level of the fifth thoracic vertebra, while the left main bronchus enters the root of the left lung opposite to the sixth thoracic vertebra. The right main bronchus subdivides into three lobar bronchi, while the left main bronchus divides into two. The lobar bronchi are also called secondary bronchi, divide into tertiary bronchi, each of which supplies air to a different bronchopulmonary segment. Next is lungs. Is the major organs of the respiratory system. It performs the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with air from the atmosphere. So the lungs are pyramid-shaped paired organs that connected to the trachea by the right and left bronchi. The lungs are also bordered by the diaphragm. So it is also separated by the mediastinum. This area contains the heart, trachea, esophagus, and many lymph nodes. So each lung is enclosed within a cavity that is surrounded by the pleura. The pleura is a serous membrane that surrounds the lung. The right and left pleura, which enclose the right and left lungs respectively, are separated by the mediastinum. The pleura consists of two layers, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura is the layer that is superficial to the lungs and extends into and lines the lung fissures, while the parietal pleura is the outer layer that connects to the thoracic wall, the mediastinum, and the diaphragm. These layers are connected to each other at the hilum. So, as you can see, the right lung is shorter and wider than the left lung, and the left lung occupies a smaller volume than the right. Each lung is composed of smaller units called lobes, and called lobes and fissures. The right lung is divided into three lobes: the upper lobe, middle lobe, and the lower lobe. So the upper lobe is the largest lobe of the right lung. It extends from the apex of the lung down to the horizontal pubic fissures. The middle lobe is the smallest lobe of the right lung. It is located between the horizontal and oblique fissures. Lastly, the lower lobe. It is the bottom lobe of the right lung and it lies beneath the oblique fissure. So, while the left lung consists only two lobes. The upper lobe of the left lung contains anterior and apico-posterior bronchopulmonary segments. It is located above the oblique fissure. And the lower lobe of the left lung contains superior, anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral bronchopulmonary segments.
The thoracic cavity. Thoracic cavity, also called as the chest cavity, is the second largest hollow space of the body. It is enclosed by the ribs, the vertebral column, and the sternum, or breastbone, and is separated from the abdominal cavity, the body's largest hollow space, by a muscular and membranous partition, the diaphragm. Thoracic cavity contains organs and tissues that functions in the respiratory. The lungs, the bronchi, the trachea, the pleura. In the cardiovascular, we have the heart, pericardium, the great vessels, and lymphatic. In the nervous is the vagus nerve, sympathetic chain, the phrenic nerve, and the recurrent laryngeal nerve, immune thymus, and the digestive esophagus system. Thoracic cavity is to house and protect several vital organs and structures of the body. Thoracic cavity has three compartments: the mediastinum. In two pleural cavities, the mediastinum is home to the heart, the trachea, the great vessels, and some other structures. The bronchopulmonary segments is a portion of lung supplied by a specific segmental bronchus and its vessels. These arteries branch from the pulmonary and bronchial arteries and run together through the center of the segments. Veins and lymphatic vessels drain along the edges of the segment. The bronchopulmonary segments having a subdivisions of one lobe of a lung based on its base is lobe contain three segments in middle lung and the lingula of two and the lower lobes of five. The bronchopulmonary segments having the seven lobes of lungs, namely the superior lobe, the apical, the posterior and anterior, middle lobe lateral, and the medial. So you can see here in the right lung, we have the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. In the left lung, we have here the superior, the main bronchus, the lobar bronchus, the cardiac notch, and the inferior lobe. Blood supply of the lungs. The lungs are supplied with the oxygenated blood paired with paired pulmonary arteries. Once the blood has received oxygenation, it leaves the lung via four pulmonary veins. Two for each lung, the bronchial lung roots, the visceral pleura, and supporting lung tissue require an extra nutritive blood supply. The pulmonary artery carries oxygen-poor blood from the right ventricle into the lung, where oxygen enters the bloodstream. There are five main types of blood vessels, with the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, the venules, and the veins. Arteries carry blood away from the heart to other organs. Blood supply of the lungs. When blood enters the right atrium, passes through the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood of the lungs where it becomes oxygenated. The oxygenated blood is brought back to the heart of the pulmonary veins, which enter the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood flows into the left ventricle. So you can see here the image of the blood supply of the lungs. We have the aorta, superior vena cava. Here in right atrium, you can see the blood passes through the left ventricle and it pumps unoxygenated blood. So the lymph drainage of the lungs. The lymphatics of the lungs and visceral pleura drains into the bronchopulmonary lymph nodes at the bifurcations of the larger bronchi. Sometimes the right duct drains into the right lymph duct and the left into the thoracic duct. The carina is at the angle situated below the tracheal bifurcation. Intrapulmonary lymph nodes. This refers to lymph nodes that lie within the lungs. These can either be peripheral lymph nodes found in outer regions of the lungs. Lymphatic drainage massage is a form of gentle massage that encourages the movement of lymph fluids around the body. The lymphatics of the lungs drains into the nodes lying in the bifurcations of the larger bronchi. The lymphatics of the lungs drains into the nodes lying at the bifurcations of the larger bronchi. You can see here, this is the same sample. The image here is also the same sample of the blood supply of the lungs. The bronchopulmonary segments also. Lastly, the nerve supply of the lungs. The lungs are supplied by nerves of the autonomic nervous system. Input from the parasympathetic nervous system occurs via vagus nerve. When stimulated by acetylcholine, this causes constrictions of the smooth muscles lining from bronchus and bronchioles and increase the secretions from glands. Nerve supply of the lungs. The parasympathetic system causes bronchoconstriction, whereas the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the bronchodilation. The vagus nerve supplies the lungs by a small nerve plexus anterior to the main bronchus, and an extensive nerve plexus posterior to the main bronchus. Here is the image also, same as the lymph drainage, the nerve supply of the lungs. So that's it.
The mechanics of respiration. Respiration consists of two phases, the inspiration and the expiration, which are accomplished by alternate increase and decrease of the capacity of the thoracic cavity. Let us compare these two phases. In quiet inspiration, the major muscles are the diaphragm and the external intercostals. As the diaphragm contracts or moves downward, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases and the intraalveolar pressure decreases from an atmospheric pressure. While in quiet expiration, it is a passive process occurring at rest, whereas forced expiration is an active process that occurs during exercise. Quiet respiration depends on elastic recall of the lungs after inspiratory stretching, elastic recall of the costal cartilage, and the relaxation of the inspiratory muscles. In forced inspiration, a maximum increase in the capacity of the thoracic cavity occurs. Every muscle that can raise the ribs is brought into action, including the scalenus anterior, medius, and the sternocleidomastoid. While the forced expiration is an active process brought about by the forcible contraction of the musculature of the anterior abdominal wall. In lung changes on inspiration, the root of the lung descends and the level of the bifurcation of the trachea may be lowered as much as 2 vertebrae, while lung changes on expiration is that the roots of the lungs ascend along with the bifurcation of the trachea. There are two types of respiration, and these are the abdominal and thoracic type of respiration. The abdominal respiration is a type of breathing exercise that helps strengthen your diaphragm, an important muscle that helps you breathe, while thoracic respiration involves breathing from upper chest, evidenced by a greater upper rib cage motion compared to the lower rib cage. Moving on to the pericardium. The pericardium is a fibrous serous sac that encloses the heart and the roots of the great vessels. Its function is to restrict excessive movements of the heart as a whole and to serve as lubricated container in which the different parts of the heart can contract. There are 3 layers of the heart, and these are the fibrous pericardium, which is a layer of connective tissue that provides support and protection for the heart. The second one is the serous pericardium. It helps to lubricate your heart. Also, it is further divided into 2 more layers, the visceral and the parietal layers. Lastly, the pericardial cavity. It acts as mechanical protection for the heart and big vessels. For the nerve supply of the pericardium, the fibrous pericardium and the parietal layer of the serous pericardium are supplied by the phrenic nerves.
The visceral layer of the serous pericardium is innervated by branches of the sympathetic trunks and the vagus nerves. Let us now proceed to the heart. The heart is a hollow muscular organ that is somewhat pyramid-shaped and lies within the pericardium in the mediastinum. It is connected at its base to the great blood vessels but otherwise lies free within the pericardium. For the surface of the heart, it has three surfaces, namely the sternocostal or the anterior, which is formed mainly by the right atrium and the right ventricle. The second one is the diaphragmatic or the inferior, which is formed mainly by right and left ventricles. And lastly, the base or the posterior, which is formed mainly by the left atrium. It also has an apex, also formed by the left ventricle, which is directed downward, forward, and to the left.
Borders of the heart. The right border is formed by the right atrium, the left border by the left auricle, and below by the left ventricle. The lower border is formed mainly by the right ventricle but also by the right atrium. The apex is formed by the left ventricle. These borders are important to recognize when examining a radiograph of the heart. Here is the illustration of borders of the heart. The four borders of the heart are the right border, inferior border, the left border, and lastly the superior border. So for the right border, it is slightly convex, formed by the right atrium and extending between the SVC and the IVC. Inferior border, it is nearly horizontal, formed mainly by the right ventricle and slightly by the left ventricle. The left border, which is oblique and it is nearly vertical, formed mainly by the left ventricle and slightly by the left auricle. The superior border, formed by the right and left atria and auricles in an anterior view. The ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk emerge from this border and the SVC enters its right side. Posterior to the aorta and pulmonary trunk and anterior to the SVC, this border forms the inferior boundary of the transverse pericardial sinus. And in the right picture or right illustration, it is the anterior surface of the heart and the great blood vessels. Chambers of the heart. The heart is divided by vertical septa into four chambers, the right and the left atria and the right and left ventricles. The right atrium lies anterior to the left atrium, and the right ventricle lies anterior to the left ventricle. The walls of the heart are composed of cardiac muscle, the myocardium, the epicardium, and the endocardium. So here is an illustration of human heart showing the four chambers. The inside of the heart is divided into four chambers that receive blood from various parts of the body. The two upper chambers are called the right atrium and the left atrium. The lower two chambers are called the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The right atrium forms the right border of the heart and receives venous blood from the SVC, IVC, and coronary cirrus. So the right border of the heart is formed by the right atrium. This chamber also contributes to the right portion of the heart's anterior surface. Blood returning to the right atrium enters through one of three vessels. These are the superior and inferior vena cava, which together deliver blood to the heart from the body, and the coronary sinus, which returns blood from the walls of the heart itself. Also, the right atrium consists of a main cavity and a small outpouching, the auricle. The right ventricle communicates with the right atrium through the atrioventricular orifice and with the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary orifice. As the cavity approaches the pulmonary orifice, it becomes funnel-shaped, at which point it is referred to as the infundibulum. So the right ventricle forms most of the anterior surface of the heart and a portion of the diaphragmatic surface. The right atrium is to the right of the right ventricle, and the right ventricle is located in front of and to the left of the right atrioventricular orifice. Blood entering the right ventricle from the right atrium therefore moves in a horizontal and forward direction. The left atrium consists of a main cavity and a left auricle. The left atrium is situated behind the right atrium and forms the greater part of the base or the posterior surface of the heart. Behind it lies the oblique sinus of the serous pericardium, and the fibrous pericardium separates it from the esophagus. The interior of the left atrium is smooth, but the left auricle possesses muscular ridges as in the right auricle. The left atrium forms most of the base or posterior surface of the heart. The left ventricle communicates with the left atrium through the atrioventricular orifice and with the aorta through the aortic orifice. The walls of the left ventricle are 3 times thicker than those of the right ventricle. The left ventricle lies anterior to the left atrium. It contributes to the anterior, diaphragmatic, and left pulmonary surfaces of the heart and forms the apex. So here is an illustration of the interior of the right atrium and the right ventricle. Structure of the heart. The walls of the heart are composed of a thick layer of cardiac muscle, the myocardium, covered externally by the epicardium and lined internally by the endocardium. The atrial portion of the heart has relatively thin walls and is divided by the atrial septum into the right and left atria. The septum runs from the anterior wall of the heart backward and to the right. The ventricular portion of the heart has thick walls and is divided by the ventricular septum into the right and left ventricles. The septum is placed obliquely with one surface facing forward and to the right and the other facing backward and to the left. Its position is indicated on the surface of the heart by the anterior and posterior interventricular grooves. The lower part of the septum is thick and formed of muscle. The smaller upper part of the septum is thin and membranous and attached to the fibrous skeleton. The so-called skeleton of the heart consists of fibrous rings that surround the atrioventricular pulmonary and aortic orifice and are continuous with the membranous upper part of the ventricular septum. The fibrous rings around the atrioventricular orifice separate the muscular walls of the atria from those of the ventricles but provide attachment for the muscle fibers. The fibrous rings support the bases of the valve cusp and prevent the valves from stretching and becoming incompetent. The skeleton of the heart forms the basis of electrical discontinuity between the atria and the ventricles. So here's an illustration of the structure of the heart. The conducting system of the heart consists of specialized cardiac muscle present in the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle and its right and left terminal branches, and the subendocardial plexus of Purkinje fibers, which specialized cardiac muscle fibers that form the conducting system of the heart. The sinoatrial node is located in the wall of the right atrium in the upper part of the sulcus terminalis, just to the right of the opening of the superior vena cava. The node spontaneously gives origin to rhythmic electrical impulses that spread in all directions through the cardiac muscle of the atria and cause the muscle to contract. The atrioventricular node is strategically placed on the lower part of the atrial septum, just above the attachment of the septal cusp of the tricuspid valve. The atrioventricular bundle is the only pathway of cardiac muscle that connects the myocardium of the atria and the myocardium of the ventricles, and is thus the only route along which the cardiac impulse can travel from the atria to the ventricles. The bundle descends through the fibrous skeleton of the heart. So the next reporter will be talking about the arterial supply of the heart.
The arterial supply of the heart. The arterial supply of the heart is provided by the right and left coronary arteries, which arise from the ascending aorta immediately above the aortic valve. Branches. We have the right venous artery, anterior ventricular branches, posterior ventricular branches, posterior interventricular descending artery, and the atrial branches. Variations in the coronary arteries. Variations in the blood supply to the heart do occur, and the most common variations affect the blood supply to the diaphragmatic surface of the both ventricles. Coronary artery anastomosis. Anastomosis between the terminal branches of the right and left coronary arteries, or the collateral circulation, exists, but they are usually not large enough to provide an adequate blood supply to the cardiac muscle should one of the large branches become blocked by disease. Venous drainage of the heart. Most blood from the heart wall drains into the right atrium to the coronary sinus, which lies in the posterior part of the anterioventricular groove and is a continuation of the great cardiac vein. Nerve supply of the heart. The heart is innervated by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic fibers of the autonomic nervous system via the cardiac plexuses situated below the arc of the aorta.
Going to discuss the thoracic cavity. So I have three contents here: action of the heart, large veins of the thorax, and large arteries of thorax. So this is a quick fun fact. The normal heart beats 70 to 90 times per minute in a resting adult, while in a newborn child, a normal heart beats goes around 130 to 150. So this is the definition of heart. Heart is a muscular pump. Series of changes that take place within it as it fills with blood and empties is referred to as the cardiac cycle. So here you can see a quick drawing of a cardiac cycle. So I'm not going to read all of this. If you want to read, just post it. So, cardiac cycle is the performance of the human heart from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the other. So, it consists of two periods. One is during which the heart muscle relaxes and refills with blood, called diastole, following a period of robust contraction and pumping of blood called the systole. So, let's proceed. Here you can see brachiocephalic veins and superior vena cava. So these are large veins of thorax. So brachiocephalic veins are referred to as the innominate veins. These are large venous structures located within the thorax and originate from the union of the subclavian vein with the internal jugular vein. The left and the right brachiocephalic vein join to form the superior vena cava on the right side of the upper chest. So here the superior vena cava contains all the venous blood from the head and neck and both upper limbs and is formed by the union of two brachiocephalic veins, just like what I have said. The left and right brachiocephalic vein join to form the superior vena cava. So let's proceed. Next topic will be the large veins of thorax. So these are called the azygous veins. So these veins have two branches, the inferior and superior hemizygous vein. So their main function is to drain blood from the posterior parts of intercostal spaces, the posterior abdominal wall, the pericardium, the diaphragm, the bronchi, and esophagus. Here, so on, I think it's the last, is the large veins of thorax. Oh no, it's not. So here you can see the inferior vena cava. So inferior vena cava pierces the central tendon of the diaphragm, opposite the athoracic vertebra, and almost immediately enters the lowest part of the right atrium. So I'm going to give a simple definition of vena cava and its function. So inferior vena cava carries blood from the legs, feet, and organs in the abdomen and pelvis. So the vena cava is the largest vein in the body. So the difference between the inferior and the superior is the superior vena cava delivers blood from the head and chest area to the heart, while the inferior one returns blood from the lower body regions to the heart. So the superior is doing its work on our upper part, in the upper part of our body, while the inferior is doing its work on the downward part of our body. So here you can see a drawing of pulmonary vein. So these are two pulmonary veins leaving each lung to carry oxygenated blood to the left atrium of the heart. So large arteries of thorax. Aorta is the main arterial trunk that delivers oxygenated blood from the left ventricle of the heart to the tissue of the body. It is divided for purposes of description into the following parts: ascending aorta, arc of aorta, descending thoracic aorta, and abdominal aorta. So ascending aorta have one branch, I think, the right coronary artery, and the arc have, I think, it have three: the brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. So that's explain the thoracic cavity. But if you want, I'm still going to give a meaning. So thoracic cavity is also called the chest cavity. It is the second largest hollow space of the body. It is enclosed by ribs, vertebral column, sternum, and breastbone, and is separated from the abdominal cavity. So the function of the thoracic cavity is to house and protect several vital organs and structures of the body.
Posterior chest wall. The spinous process of the thoracic vertebrae can be palpated in the midline posteriorly. So the first spinous process to be felt is that of the seventh cervical vertebrae, which is the vertebrae prominens. The spine of C1 to 6 vertebrae are covered by a large ligament, which is the ligamentum nuchae. So let's have here the scapula. As you can see in the picture, with the red mark, this is the scapula. So the scapula, or the shoulder blade, is flat and triangular in shape and is located in the upper part of the posterior surface of the thorax. Superior scapula, or the superior scapula angle. The superior scapula angle lies opposite the spine of the second thoracic vertebrae. So this is the superior scapula with the red mark, or with the red line. Spine of scapula. The spine of scapula is subcutaneous and the root of the spine lies on a level with the spine of the third thoracic vertebrae. And lastly is the inferior scapula. The inferior scapular angle lies on a level with the spine of the seventh thoracic vertebrae. Lines of orientation. Several imaginary lines are sometimes used to describe surface location on the anterior and posterior chest wall. First, let's have here the midsternal line. On the front of the thorax, one of the most important vertical lines is the midsternal line, the middle line of the sternum. It can be interpreted as a component of the median plane. So as you can see here in the red mark or in the red circle, this is the midsternal line. Next would be the midclavicular line. The midclavicular line is an imaginary line parallel to the long axis of the body and passing through the midpoint of the clavicle on the ventral surface of the body. So this is the midclavicular line from here down to here. Next would be the anterior axillary line. The axillary lines are the anterior axillary line, mid-axillary line, and the posterior axillary line. The anterior axillary line is a coronal line on the anterior torso marked by the anterior axillary fold. So this is the anterior axillary line, which is the red mark there, or the red line. Next would be the posterior axillary line. The posterior axillary line is a coronal line on the posterior torso marked by the posterior axillary fold. So this is the posterior axillary line. You can see it here from 1 to 3, from the third one. Next would be the mid-axillary line. The mid-axillary line is an imaginary landmark line that runs through an individual's torso, separating the body into its anterior or front and posterior or back halves. So at the center, this is the mid-axillary line, which separate the anterior and the posterior. And lastly would be the scapular line. The scapular line, also known as the line scapulis, is a vertical line passing through the inferior angle of the scapula. It has been used in the evaluation of brachial plexus birth palsy. So this is the scapular line. Trachea. The trachea extends from the lower border of the cricoid cartilage opposite the body of the sixth cervical vertebra, in the neck to the level of the sternal angle in the thorax. It commences in the midline and ends just to the right of the midline by dividing into the right and the left principal bronchi. At the root of the neck, it may be palpated in the midline in the suprasternal notch. Lungs. The lungs are a pair of spongy, air-filled organs located on either side of the chest thorax. The trachea windpipe conducts inhaled air into the lungs through its tubular branches called bronchi. The bronchi then divided into smaller and smaller branches, which is bronchioles, finally becoming microscopic. Location of the lung lobe. The lungs are located on either side of the heart and are separated by features into lobes, 3 in the right and 2 lobes in the left. So this is the illustration. First would be the apex of the lung. The apex of the lung projects into the neck. It can be mapped out on the anterior surface of the body by drawing a curved line convex upward from the sternoclavicular joint to a point 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter above the junction of the medial and intermediate third of the clavicle. The anterior border of the right lung. The anterior border of the right lung begins behind the sternoclavicular joint and rounds downward, almost reaching the midline behind the sternal angle. The anterior border of the left lung has a similar course, but at the level of the fourth costal cartilage, it deviates laterally and extends for a variable distance beyond the lateral margin of the sternum to form the cardiac notch. So this notch is produced by a heart displacing the lung to the left. The lower border of the lung. The lower border of the lung crosses the sixth rib of the mid-clavicular line and the eighth rib in the mid-axillary line and reaches the 10th rib adjacent to the vertebral column posteriorly. The posterior border of the lung. The posterior border of the lung extends downward from the spinous process of the 7th cervical vertebra to the level of the 10th thoracic vertebrae and lines about 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters from the midline. The oblique features. The oblique features of the lung can be indicated on the surface by a line drawn from the root of the spine of the scapula obliquely downward, laterally and anteriorly following the course of the sixth rib to the sixth costochondral junction. And lastly, the horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure represented by a line drawn horizontally along the fourth costal cartilage. Above the horizontal fissure lies the upper lobe, and below it lies the middle lobe. Below and posterior to the oblique fissure lies the lower lobe.
Thoracic cavity, or the branches of thoracic cavity. Posterior anterior radiograph is one of the branches of thoracic cavity. So what is posterior anterior radiograph? It is a chest X-ray taken with the chest against the film plate on the X-ray machine behind the patient, or it is taken with the anterior wall of the patient's chest touching the cassette holder and with the X-rays traversing the thorax from the posterior to the anterior aspect. As you can see in the image, there is bones, trachea, diaphragm, lungs, trachea, and mediastinum. So the function of the bones in there is that if you wanna see the posterior anterior radiograph of your bones, the trachea, the diaphragm, lungs, trachea, and mediastinum, you have to do this. So for the bones, the thoracic vertebrae are imperfectly seen. So the costal transverse joints on each rib should be examined in order from above downward and compared to the fellows of the opposite side. And for the diaphragm casts dome-shaped shadows on each side. The one on the right is simply higher than the one on the left. So note that cassette-trophonic angle where the diaphragm meets the thoracic wall. Beneath the right dome is the homogeneous tan shading of the liver, and beneath the left dome, a gas bubble may be seen in the fundus of the stomach. So for the trachea, the red translucent air-filled shading of the trachea is seen in the midline of the neck as a dark area. So like this is superimposed on the lower cervical and upper thoracic vertebrae. And for the lungs, looking first at the lung roots, one sees relatively dense shading caused by the presence of the blood-filled pulmonary and bronchial vessels, the large bronchi, and the lymph nodes. The lung fields, by virtue of the air they contain, readily permit the passage of X-rays. So for this reason, the lungs are more translucent on full inspiration than on expiration. And for the last one, the mediastinum, the shadows is produced by the various structures within the mediastinum, superimpose one on the other. So like note that the outline of the heart and great vessels, or the transverse diameter of the heart, should not exceed half the width of the thoracic cage. You have to remember that on deep inspiration, when the diaphragm descends, the vertical length of the heart increases. So again, when the diaphragm descends, the vertical length of the heart increases. So and the transverse diameter is narrowed. In infants, the heart is always wider and more globular in shape than in adults. See right oblique radiograph. So what is right oblique radiograph? We are done in the left oblique radiograph, so we are moving on to right oblique radiograph. So again, what is a right oblique radiograph? So a right oblique radiograph is obtained by rotating the patient so that the right anterior chest wall is touching the cassette holder and the X-ray transfers the thorax from posterior to anterior in oblique direction. The heart shadow is largely made up by the right ventricle. So our next topic is bronchography and contrast. What is bronchography and contrast? So what is bronchography and contrast? So bronchography, it is a special study of bronchial by means of the introduction of iodized oil or other contrast medium into a particular bronchus or bronchial. Usually under fluoroscopic control, the contrast media are non-irritating and sufficiently radiographed to allow good visualization of the bronchi. So our next one is coronary angiography. As you can see in the image, the coronary arteries can be visualized with the introduction of radiopacked material into their lumen. Under fluoroscopic control, a long narrow catheter is passed into the ascending aorta via the femoral artery and the leg. CT scanning of the thorax. CT scanning relies on the same physics as conventional X-rays, but combines it with computer technology. A source of X-rays moves in an arc around the thorax and sends out a beam of X-rays. The beams of X-rays having passed through the thoracic wall and the thoracic viscera.